Boosting the economy is the latest reform on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's agenda. Hoping for more foreign dollars for India, Modi and his party, the BJP, have announced sweeping economic reforms, including the push for more foreign dollars in sectors like Indian defence and pharmaceuticals. A little later in the programme, we'll be talking to two prominent members of India's rival political parties. But first, CCTV's Shweta Bajaj joins us from New Delhi. And Shweta, what are some of the highlights of these new economic reforms?
The highlight on top, of course, is the civil aviation industry and the defence industry. These two sectors are one that have benefited hugely by the latest rung of economic reforms announced by the Indian government. The other sectors includes pharmaceuticals, also single-brand retail outlets. There are also smaller sectors like animal husbandry, where FDI has been allowed. But critical is really the civil aviation sector and defence sector. It's also given a shot in the arm to the civil aviation sector here in India. It has been suffering in the last few months. For instance, international companies like Air Asia, who entered the Indian market, weren't able to make enough money. In fact, its chief, Tony Fernandes, has been repeatedly saying that this particular FDI open gives him a larger framework to actually operate international flights out of India, helping civil aviation sector. Next in line, defence sector. It's very clear what the Narendra Modi government wants to do. It wants to make India a hub for defence manufacturing. If you look at the constraints that the industry had till now, included the original equipment manufacturers. They weren't really comfortable giving their technologies to India and setting up shop here. Now that has been taken away. The 100% FDI gives them a room to be able to actually set up shop. One of the big aims of the Narendra Modi government.
Well, of course, these are sweeping reforms. They are very significant. What's been the reaction within the Indian government and among the Indian people?
If you look at the Indian government itself, of course, as far as the ruling party is concerned, they have been hailing the economic reforms. As far as the opposition is concerned, understandably so, has been questioning the way the FDI sectors have been opened, questioning why has defence sector in particular been opened, giving access to foreign companies to set up shop here in India. The second in line, if you look at the economic platform itself, they of course are a happy lot. Across industry chambers, whether it's the Confederation of Indian Industry or CII, or the Federation of Chambers of Indian Industry called FICCI, they both have hailed the move, especially in the civil aviation sector, along with the defence sector, which is likely to see massive FDI, foreign direct investment, coming into the country. If you look at the people itself, well, as far as India is concerned, it's the youngest country. Everybody wants more jobs to be created. That remains one of the biggest hiccups. But just to give you the sense of within the ruling party as well, the former finance minister who comes from the Bharatiya Janata Party or BJP, Mr. Narendra Modi's party, Yashwant Sinha has himself said that as far as India is concerned, even if the growth figures go up, the fact remains that India has many poor and they are only increasing. So really varied reactions coming in, but all in all, I think everybody wants to see some sort of results as far as economic performance and job creation is concerned.
Thanks, Shweta. That's CCTV's Shweta Bajaj reporting from New Delhi. Joining me now from New Delhi via Skype is Shankar Aiyar. He is a prominent Indian political figure and senior leader for the Indian National Congress Party. Mr. Aiyar has served as a diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service and was a member of the Indian Parliament. Mr. Aiyar, thanks for joining us. Well, with this announcement, India is now saying to the world that it is open for business. What do you make of this latest announcement by the government?
Well, rhetoric is much easier than getting it done on the ground. Having, for example, just this morning, our newspapers report that owing to certain rules relating to investment in the civil aviation sector not having been changed, despite the announcement of policy, it is going to be impossible, they say, for investment by foreigners to take place in our civil aviation sector. And at the same time, the private civil aviation sector in India is saying that we should not be extending to foreigners in India in the civil aviation sector the kind of concessions that foreign countries do not extend to us in their country. So while we welcome the announcement of liberalization of foreign direct investment in India, I think there is still a great deal of work to be done before we see these grand intentions being translated into results on the ground. We've had this repeatedly happen with us in the attempts at liberalization and globalization over the last 25 years, and I see it now happening again. So I'm only cautiously optimistic. I think the government has to do its homework, at least now, for having failed to do its homework before announcing the policy.
Now, India's growth rate is expected at around 7.6% this year. That will be among the highest in the world. Do you believe that these provisions announced by the government will help growth in India?
I totally distrust our statistics regarding GDP growth. This is not because these statistics for this year are necessarily wrong in terms of the methodology adopted, but because it shows up our growth rate as approximately 2% higher than was being achieved under the previous methodology. So one can't determine the rate of growth on the basis of methodology. There has to be a certain objectivity and comparability between different figures. But yes, the Indian economy has been on a higher trajectory for the last several years. And therefore, one might hope that notwithstanding various political and economic difficulties, we will continue to be on a higher trajectory, but without allowing these figures to dazzle us. So I take a bit skeptically the argument that India has already overtaken China. That is still to be fully established. And further, it is to be established that what we are up to just now is sustainable in economic terms, but more importantly, sustainable in political and social terms, since higher growth is translating into greater inequality. And while in a country like China, that can be contained by strong political action and one party rule, in the kind of vibrant democracy that we have in India, I don't think we can be as neglectful of the social dimensions and political dimensions of fast growth as those with a more authoritarian system have been able to have in recent years.
The Indian Prime Minister is making much of the fact that these new measures, these new provisions or liberalization policies will make the country one of the most open in the world economically. Do you believe that's a good thing for India?
Well, we were the ones who started the opening of the economy. And so I think, to be consistent with our position in the past, we should welcome the progressive further opening of the Indian economy. But whether this is actually happening or remains in the realm of prime ministerial rhetoric, which is our prime minister's chief attribute, I'm not sure. And so instead of prejudging what might happen, I would prefer to wait and watch. Although as an Indian and a proud Indian, I would of course like to see these dreams that the prime minister is placing before the nation actually get realized.
India currently has something like 1 million job seekers coming onto the labour market every month. Do you think that these measures announced of the government will help in job creation?
Well, if we go by the past record, they won't. Civil aviation in particular is a highly technical sector. And it is only those who would otherwise have got jobs who would get better jobs in the civil aviation sector, as has happened, for example, in our information technology sector. Those who would have got jobs get better jobs. But those who wouldn't have got jobs are simply pushed out of the labor market. And that is why, compared to our requirement of close on 1 million new employment opportunities every month, we are actually getting only about 100,000 jobs every month. In other words, only 1/10 of the requirement is being met, and the backlog is growing exponentially. So the failure to ensure growth with employment and just allow jobless growth to take place is, I think, the single biggest failure of our current government and of perhaps the policies of liberalization that we have adopted for the last several years. for much of the FDI that comes into India comes with technologies that were invented for a Western economy that lacks labor. It does not, it leads to higher labor productivity by reducing the labor force. So if we have technology that is not labor intensive, then I'm afraid higher productivity may result, but not higher employment. And that means we are storing up a lot of trouble for ourselves in the future.
Mr. Iyer, how would you rate Prime Minister Modi's economic leadership in India?
Oh, about 3 out of 10.
That's not very good. Why?
Because the single most important sector of our economy is the agricultural sector. And we have been suffering a possibly unprecedented agrarian distress over these last 2 years. And although the government appears now to be waking up to the dimensions of this agricultural crisis, the steps they are taking are not only too little, but also very hypocritical. For example, the finance minister announced a substantial increase in the budget allocation for agriculture, for the Ministry of Agriculture. And then when one looked again at the figure, we found that what was being given out of the budget of the Ministry of Finance has simply been transferred to the Ministry of Agriculture, which makes the increase in the monies available to the agriculture sector only marginally more than they have been over the last 2 years. So where is the substantive answer?
Mr. Shankar Aiyar, thanks for joining us, sir.